Greetings, this is Management 430, and this is the lecture on HR metrics. Going into the first slide, we go back to the Human Resource Management System model, and what I'm trying to get at now is actually the bottom box, the outcomes and evaluation rather, of HR practices. How do we assess our planning and our implementation activities and ensure that we are accomplishing what we set out to accomplish? So we design metrics as a way to assess our outcomes and evaluate them, and to make sure that we are on target with what it is that we're trying to accomplish. HR plays a really integral role in making sure the organization is successful, and there's a lot of different ways that that is done. Okay, moving on to the next slide, where it's titled HR as Organizational Contributor. HR basically takes a three-pronged approach, if you will, to its impact on the organization, on its productivity, on how it supports customer service and quality, and on the financial contributions that it makes to the organization and its bottom line. We'll talk about the productivity and things in a few minutes. The HR and the TQM activities, I mean, you've taken courses or will be taking courses in quality and operations management, and I know that they talk quite a bit about the role, the impact that HR plays on total quality management. And the bottom line is HR has to train the employees to be prepared. HR is a partner with operations to ensure that the employees are capable of engaging in the TQM activities that are so important to the company. In terms of the financial contributions, the company is looking for whether or not the HR activities that are set up are effective and efficient. So there is a return on investment for HR activities, just as there are for any other kind of quote-unquote investment that an organization is engaged in. And that gives you an example of how it would be calculated. If we want to know whether or not there were any improvements, we look at productivity improvements for the time period. We look at the cost for acquiring the new skill, so if it's a cost for training and development or cost for new resources to support the human resource function. What are some enhancements that we did, and basically we decide whether or not the investment that we put into this new program actually has a good return on its investment, that we get more productivity gains than we've lost by doing something new and exciting. Moving on to slide 4, here we talk about, and we can see the impact of HR on productivity, and 4 basic ways that HR has an impact on productivity. Increasing productivity, reducing costs, through restructuring, through redesigning work, through the alignment of all sorts of HR activities amongst themselves, as well as the alignment with other functions in the company, and then any potential outsourcing that needs to be done. Now, we talked about outsourcing in the very first introduction to HR lecture, where we talked about how some HR activities can and should be outsourced. And so the question is, how do we decide, which HR activities should be outsourced, right? Outsourcing isn't just limited to HR activities. The company can outsource all sorts of different activities. It can outsource labor. It can outsource going to different kind of suppliers. So instead of making the supplies in-house, they outsource to a different vendor to create those products for them. They can outsource marketing and sales. They could outsource manufacturing, depending on the kind of organization you have, the kind of structure that you have. So HR helps decide with the organization what if anything, should be outsourced, because it might be a cheaper option to outsource the work or the labor to somebody else who may have greater expertise in something, as opposed to keeping the work in-house. One of the big challenges that we face with these new trade agreements is, of course, that we do a lot more outsourcing internationally, and as we outsource things more internationally, we lose domestic jobs. And so there's always a trade-off there as well. There may be a short-term financial benefit, but we might create a long-term drag on the economy if all the jobs are outsourced. So it's really important. Politicians don't always think about this, but certainly organizations need to think about this, the balanced approach. Is it more important to outsource now to save money, or should we be thinking about the long-term impact of training and outsourcing? Aligning HR activities, we also discussed this and we talked about strategic HR, how we want to make sure that the HR activities are in alignment with the corporate strategy, but HR activities also need to be aligned with each other. For example, we have to decide that if we want a certain kind of behavior in our employees, that we've got in a system that's aligned that supports that. For example, we want our employees to work in teams, so we have to be careful how we reward them and how we train them. We don't train them to be individual employees and reward them to work as individuals when we want them to work in teams. We need to have a compensation system that supports the kind of behaviors and activities that we want our employees to engage in. So when we think about training and development, what kind of training systems we might set up depends on whether or not we're going to hire the skills that we need, or we want to train people in-house to have those skills. We have to sort of decide what's the more important approach. And so training and development supports selection and recruiting, compensation supports performance management and performance appraisal. So all these HR activities have to work together in concert. They can't work independently. So there needs to be really important communication and interaction amongst the HR disciplines. In terms of restructuring the organization or redesigning the work, what we're talking about now is looking at the way things are done and deciding what changes need to be made. At a more macro level, we could restructure the organization. We can decide that this structure doesn't work for us. We want people to work in teams, so we're going to change the way that we structure the organization to be able to help us to make better decisions and to be able to do the work that we need to do. We may decide to do like Cisco System does, where we acquire businesses, and so we need to then develop, HR policies to help the organization merge into, the home company. So, how do we create a smooth transition and a seamless way of doing business when we're bringing in outsiders? If we need to lay people off, sometimes we need to make a decision, as we talked about, to retrench, to shrink our size because a department or a division is not performing the way we want it to, and so we may need to engage in layoffs. So HR plays a role in all of those activities because it has to advise on what they think might be the best approach for managing the people. And they also help with dealing with implementing those changes. They're engaged in the change management stuff. Redesigning work, they can also at a more micro level decide how we can change the way people do their jobs, changing their workloads, changing the tasks that they do, reshaping the way work is done because new technology is introduced to a particular job type. And so an organization depends on HR to assess at the more micro level how work is done and how it can be improved. So HR works at a more macro level with restructuring the organization, at a very micro level dealing with redesigning work. It can engage in a more macro approach to deciding to outsource the work, as we talked about. And then aligning our HR activities so that HR is working together, so that when we're restructuring the organization and we're making these changes, that the new HR activities are going to be working in alignment with the goals of the company. Moving on to the next slide. How do we develop HR metrics. What's important to consider in doing this? Number one, we need to make sure accurate data is collected, that we're collecting information that is accurate. So if we're developing metrics, if the data is not accurate, it's not going to help us. Second, we want to make sure that what we're creating, the measures that we're creating, are linked to strategic and operational objectives. We already talked about strategy. So in order for us to ensure that the HR activities are in alignment with corporate strategy, we have to make sure the measures of our success or failure are measuring how well those strategic and operational objectives are in alignment with the corporate strategy and whether or not they're actually successful. We want to make sure that we're not making things too complex. The calculations have to be clearly understood. They have to be managed well. We want to make sure that the measures provide information expected by executives, that we are providing information that executives want and need in order to be able to guide and manage the organization as best they can. We also want to make sure that when we're measuring things, that we've got internal metrics and external metrics against which we can compare things, because our goal is, we want to benchmark against successful companies, but we also want to keep trends about how well we're doing on things to make sure that we are in alignment there as well. Lastly, we want to make sure that when we collect this information, that it's actually being used and it's going to drive how we do things in HR. Going back to that HR system model, we get all that information and the assessment and the evaluation and the feedback of the outcomes, and then that's a feedback loop. It needs to go back and change how we plan, how we implement things, and then we can assess again whether or not those changes that we made are successful. So we have to collect good information, we have to make sure it's useful, it's understood, that we've got good benchmarks against which to judge it, and then we have to actually use that information to make the changes that we need to make. Our next slide, slide 6, talks about different kinds of metrics. HR can assess, 4 different general areas. They can have an impact on strategy or the strategic perspective. They can have an impact on operations, on the financials, and as well as customer perspectives. And so each one of those categories looks at different things. For example, on the financial side, we want to make sure that our compensation and benefits per employee are reasonable and that they're competitive, but we're not paying above what we're capable of paying. We want to look at turnover cost. We know that turnover has a cost, and we'll talk about that in the second week's material. The turnover cost can be really exorbitant if we're not managing all of our HR activities. If people are not happy, if they're not motivated, if they're not feeling safe in their company, they're more likely to turn over. We want to look at profit per employee, sales per employee. If we have too many employees, even if we're profitable, we're diluting our profitability by having more people than we need. They may be wasting time and effort and resources by having more employees than we need. So we want to make sure that we are maximizing the use of and the skills of our employees to maximize sales and profit. In terms of the operational perspective, for example, what is our attrition rate? How often do people leave and why do they leave? What is the training cost for an employee? How much are we spending on training and why are we spending it? What's the return on investment? Are we getting a bang for our buck when we invest in training? Because it's not enough to just say we invest in training and look, everybody got, $5,000 worth of training this year, whoop-de-doo. It's everybody got $5,000 worth of training and our productivity went up and our sales went up and our success rate went up and our market share went up. We need to say that the investment that we engaged in per employee not only was a solid amount, but it also had an impact on the bottom line of the company. We want to make sure we track how long it takes us to fill vacancies, because vacancies mean less productivity. So we don't want to have long vacancies. We want to have short vacancies if possible. Strategy, same sort of thing. We want to know what the company culture's like and how that affects the company strategy. Are we managing our budget well? Are we helping the company go and engage in change management? All of these things are essential. Lastly, the customer perspective, right? The idea that HR is a customer, and what are the the employees are the customer of the HR department. So do the employees believe that the company is doing well by them, through the HR department, and also what is the employer's perspective, generally speaking, by employees? Does the company does the employees like the company? Do they like them as an employer? And what impact is that going to have overall in the company's ability to attract talent, retain talent, and also be competitive in the market? So HR metrics can fall under these 4 general categories. There's many, many more metrics. This is not a limited list, right? There's a greater list out there. This is just a subheading of the different kinds of metrics that HR can use, but there's many, many more metrics that we can use and design as we need, depending on what's going on with the company. Lastly, measuring the strategic effectiveness of the organization, the HR effectiveness. We talked about doing ROI.